The date was September 18, 2012, when emergency responders arrived at the Mitchell residence in suburban Portland, Oregon, a city known for its progressive values and tight-knit communities nestled in the shadow of Mount Hood. What they discovered inside the two-story craftsman-style home would shake this rain-soaked Pacific Northwest city to its core. 12-year-old Emma Mitchell lay motionless at the bottom of the basement stairs, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, the victim of what would initially appear to be a tragic accident. Standing at the top of those stairs, her face a mask of shock that witnesses would later describe as disturbingly vacant, was 15-year-old Sarah Mitchell, Emma's older sister. If this is your first time discovering our channel, we invite you to subscribe and share in the comments where you're joining us from today. Your engagement allows us to continue bringing you these detailed examinations of cases that challenge everything we think we understand about family, childhood, and the capacity for violence that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. The morning had begun unremarkably in the Mitchell household, with all the typical chaos of a family preparing for the school day ahead. Richard and Jennifer Mitchell, both educators at local Portland schools, had been rushing through their usual routines when the first signs of tension emerged between their daughters. Emma, a straight A student and accomplished violinist, had borrowed Sarah's vintage band t-shirt without permission, a shirt Sarah had saved for months to purchase from an online auction site. The shirt, featuring a limited edition design from Sarah's favorite indie band, represented more than just clothing to the teenager. It was one of the few things she considered truly hers, in a household where Emma's achievements seemed to overshadow everything else. The argument that erupted over breakfast had been fierce enough that Jennifer Mitchell confiscated the shirt from Emma, telling both girls that neither would wear it until they could learn to share and communicate respectfully. Sarah's face, according to her father's later testimony, had darkened with a rage disproportionate to the situation, her hands clenching into fists as she hissed at Emma, "You ruin everything. I wish you would just disappear." Both parents had dismissed the comment as typical sibling rivalry, with Richard telling Sarah to get over it before driving Emma to her middle school. Jennifer informed Sarah that she would need to take the bus as additional punishment for her outburst, unaware that this seemingly minor disciplinary decision would set in motion events that would destroy their family forever. What investigators would painstakingly reconstruct in the days and weeks following Emma's death was a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that began the moment Sarah's parents' cars disappeared down the tree-lined street. Sarah did not board the bus that morning. Instead, security footage from a neighbor's home surveillance system captured her standing on the front porch, watching and waiting, her posture suggesting calculation rather than the distress one might expect from a teenager who had just lost a treasured possession to her sister's carelessness. The calculated nature of what followed, the methodical way Sarah would create an opportunity to be alone with Emma, would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument that this was no accident, no momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act of violence born from months of simmering resentment and rage. By 9:45 that morning, Sarah had called her school's attendance line, perfectly replicating her mother's voice and speech patterns to report that she was ill with a migraine and would be staying home. The attendance secretary would later testify that nothing in the call raised suspicion. Sarah's imitation was flawless, practiced, suggesting this was not the first time she had employed this deception. 20 minutes later, a second call was placed to Emma's middle school, again with Sarah impersonating her mother. This time claiming a dental emergency required Emma to be released early into her sister's care. The vice principal who processed Emma's early dismissal would later recall the interaction in heartbreaking detail during the trial. Emma seemed excited rather than confused about the sudden departure, chattering enthusiastically about a science project as Sarah signed her out, using practiced forgery of their mother's signature. She kept telling her sister about some experiment with crystals, the vice principal testified, her voice breaking with emotion. Sarah just nodded, not really responding, but Emma didn't seem to notice. She was so happy to share what she was learning. She trusted her sister completely. Portland's public transportation system provided the means for the sisters' journey home, with the bus driver who transported them later describing Sarah as unusually quiet and withdrawn, while Emma talked animatedly about school, seemingly oblivious to her sister's dark mood. These mundane moments, a bus ride, a 12-year-old's excited chatter about science class, would soon be transformed into the final, normal experiences of Emma Mitchell's young life. The last time she would experience the ordinary joys of childhood, before her sister's resentment exploded into irreversible violence. The Mitchell home, a charming craftsman with a meticulously maintained garden and cheerful yellow shutters, sat on a quiet street, where neighbors knew each other by name and children played freely in front yards. It was the kind of neighborhood where people prided themselves on looking out for one another, where tragedy seemed impossible. That such an ordinary setting would become the location of such extraordinary violence added another dimension of horror to an already disturbing case. The comfortable, safe environment that the Mitchells had worked so hard to create for their daughters would be forever tainted by what occurred within its walls that September morning. Emma Mitchell was born on March 3, 2000, in Portland, Oregon, the second daughter of Richard and Jennifer Mitchell, and, from her earliest moments, a source of joy and wonder for her family. Home videos played during the trial showed a curly-haired little girl with an infectious laugh, eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and an enthusiasm for learning that emerged early and never diminished. Emma approached the world with a scientist's mind and an artist's heart, equally comfortable dissecting the mechanics of how things worked, as she was losing herself in the emotional landscape of classical music. By age 12, Emma had already distinguished herself as both an academic achiever and a talented musician. Her violin teacher described her as possessing a rare combination of technical precision and emotional depth, able to convey feelings through her instrument that seemed beyond her years. When Emma played, you forgot she was a child, her teacher told the courtroom, tears streaming down her face. The music she created came from somewhere deep inside, somewhere pure and beautiful that most of us spend our whole lives trying to access. Emma's academic achievements were equally impressive, with her science teacher noting that she had the curiosity and methodology of a much older student. She didn't just want to know what happened in an experiment. She wanted to understand why, how the underlying principles connected to larger patterns in nature. Her dream was to become a marine biologist, specifically studying the deep ocean creatures that most people found frightening, but that Emma saw as fascinating examples of adaptation and survival. The bookshelf in her room, carefully preserved by her parents as a kind of shrine, held an impressive collection of marine biology texts that Emma had been working through systematically, making notes in the margins with questions and observations that revealed a truly scientific mind. The relationship between Emma and Sarah had been complicated long before the events of September 18, 2012, though the warning signs had been subtle enough that the Mitchell parents, busy with their own teaching careers and the daily demands of raising two daughters, had largely missed or minimized them. Friends and family members would later recall moments that, in retrospect, should have raised concerns. Sarah's increasingly bitter comments about Emma's successes, her tendency to accidentally damage Emma's possessions, the way her face would harden when their parents praised Emma's latest achievement or award. Sarah loved Emma when they were younger, Jennifer Mitchell testified, her voice barely audible as she struggled to reconcile her memories with the terrible reality. I have photos of Sarah reading to Emma, helping her learn to ride a bike, braiding her hair. Something changed when Emma started middle school and began excelling at everything she tried. It was like Sarah couldn't be happy for her anymore. Every one of Emma's successes felt like a personal failure to Sarah. This dynamic, the accomplished younger sibling inadvertently highlighting the older sibling's perceived shortcomings, was something Sarah's therapist, Dr. Allison Reeves, would later identify as a critical factor in understanding what happened. Sarah wasn't a bad student, Dr. Reeves explained to the court, but she was average in a household where excellence had become the expected standard. Her grades were B's and C's, where Emma's were straight A's. She played guitar adequately, while Emma's violin performances earned standing ovations. Most devastatingly for Sarah, she felt invisible next to her sister's shine, perpetually living in a shadow she could never escape. Sarah described feeling like a ghost in her own home, Dr. Reeves testified. She felt that her parents only noticed her when she did something wrong, while Emma received constant praise and attention for doing everything right. This perception, whether entirely accurate or distorted by adolescent emotion, became Sarah's reality. A reality where the only way to be seen was for Emma to disappear. Emma's funeral was attended by over 400 people, an overwhelming turnout for a 12-year-old that spoke to the impact she had made in her short life. Classmates filled 3 rows, many wearing handmade shirts that read, "Emma's Scientist in honor of her love of discovery." Her violin teacher brought Emma's instrument, placing it gently beside the closed casket. Closed because the injuries from the fall had been too severe for an open casket service, a detail that haunted everyone who loved her. The principal of Emma's school delivered a eulogy that left few dry eyes in the chapel. "Emma Mitchell was the kind of student every teacher hopes to encounter in their career," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She made us better at our jobs because she challenged us to give her more, to dig deeper, to help her understand the world in all its complexity. But more than her academic gifts, Emma was kind. She tutored classmates who struggled. She invited the lonely kid to sit at her lunch table. She saw the best in people and brought it out in them." The small white casket, adorned with drawings from Emma's classmates, showing her favorite things, violins, whales, test tubes, and flowers, served as a devastating reminder of the potential that had been violently extinguished. In the years following Emma's death, her parents established the Emma Mitchell Science Scholarship, providing opportunities for middle school girls to attend summer marine biology camps and STEM programs. "We wanted Emma's passion for discovery to live on," Richard Mitchell explained during a fundraising event, his eyes hollow with grief. "We can't bring her back, but we can help other young scientists pursue the dreams Emma never got to fulfill." The 911 call came at 12:53 p.m. On September 18, 2012, Jennifer Mitchell's panicked voice reporting that her daughter had fallen down the basement stairs and wasn't breathing. Patrol officers Kevin Stark and Maria Chen arrived at the Mitchell residence within 6 minutes, followed immediately by paramedics who quickly confirmed what the responding officers had already suspected. 12-year-old Emma Mitchell had been dead for some time, her body already beginning to show signs of rigor mortis. The officers secured the scene, gently guiding a hysterical Jennifer Mitchell to the living room, while cordoning off the basement stairs where Emma's small body lay in an unnatural position at the bottom. Sarah Mitchell sat on the staircase leading to the second floor, her expression eerily calm as she watched the chaos unfold around her sister's body, a demeanor that Officer Chen would later describe in her report as disturbingly detached, showing no visible signs of the grief or shock one would expect from a sibling witness to such a tragedy. Detective Marcus Liu arrived at the scene at 1:15 p.m., a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau who specialized in suspicious death investigations. The craftsman-style home, with its warm wood tones and family photographs covering nearly every wall, seemed an unlikely setting for the tragedy that had unfolded within. Detective Liu's first observation, carefully documented in his case file, was the inconsistency between Sarah's account and the physical evidence at the scene. Sarah's initial statement was straightforward. Emma had come home early from school feeling unwell, had decided to retrieve some craft supplies from the basement, and Sarah had heard a scream, followed by a terrible crash. Racing to the basement door, Sarah claimed she found Emma at the bottom of the stairs, already unconscious. "I tried to help her," Sarah told Detective Liu, her voice flat and mechanical. "I checked if she was breathing, but she wasn't moving. That's when I called my mom." Yet the physical evidence contradicted this narrative in several crucial ways. First, Emma's position at the bottom of the stairs, lying on her side, with her arms tucked beneath her body, was inconsistent with a tumbling fall downstairs, which typically results in a more sprawled position. Second, the pattern of bruising on Emma's body, while consistent with impact trauma, included marks on her upper back and shoulders that suggested downward pressure rather than the random impacts of a fall. Most significantly, there was no debris trail down the stairs. No scattered craft supplies, no indication that Emma had been carrying anything when she fell. From the first moment I examined the scene, something felt wrong, Detective Liu would later testify during the trial. The story didn't match the evidence, the positioning of the body, the lack of any scattered items, the specific pattern of injuries. None of it aligned with an accidental fall scenario. While paramedics respectfully covered Emma's body and crime scene, technicians began their methodical documentation of the scene. Detective Liu conducted a preliminary interview with Sarah in the family's kitchen. What emerged during this initial conversation would become the first thread that, when pulled, would unravel Sarah's carefully constructed narrative. Sarah claimed she had been in her bedroom when she heard Emma scream, but a neighbor working from home directly next door reported hearing no screams. Only what sounded like a brief argument, followed by a loud crash around 11:30 a.m., more than an hour before Sarah claimed the incident occurred. When Liu asked Sarah what she had been doing all morning, she initially claimed to have been homesick with a migraine, but then contradicted herself by mentioning she had been listening to music loudly in her room, an activity unlikely for someone suffering from a severe headache. The foundational clue that would ultimately break the case emerged when crime scene technician James Rodriguez noticed defensive bruising on Emma's forearms, bruises that appeared fresher than the injuries from the fall itself. When Detective Liu asked Sarah if Emma had struggled with her in any way, Sarah became visibly agitated, her previous calm cracking as she insisted she had barely touched her sister except to check for breathing. The presence of defensive bruising on the victim's arms, separate from the fall injuries, immediately suggested this was not a simple accident, Liu explained during a press conference after the trial. These marks indicated Emma had been in a physical altercation shortly before her death, and the only person with her was her sister. The preliminary examination of Emma's body by medical examiner Dr. Thomas Brennan revealed several findings that further contradicted Sarah's account of an accidental fall. The pattern of cervical spine damage, while consistent with a fall downstairs, was most consistent with force applied from behind and above, as if someone had pushed rather than Emma simply losing her balance. Additionally, Dr. Brennan identified petechial hemorrhaging in Emma's eyes, tiny burst blood vessels that can indicate strangulation or oxygen deprivation prior to death. The cervical fracture pattern, combined with the petechial hemorrhaging and defensive bruising, painted a picture inconsistent with a simple fall, Dr. Brennan noted in his preliminary report filed from the scene. These findings suggested the victim had been in a struggle shortly before the fatal injury occurred. As the investigation at the Mitchell home continued, officers were dispatched to both girls' schools to verify Sarah's story about them both being home due to illness and emergency. The inconsistencies mounted rapidly as school administrators confirmed that Sarah had called, pretending to be her mother, then later called Emma's school under the same false pretense to have her released. Security footage from Emma's middle school showed Sarah signing her sister out at 10:20 a.m., appearing calm and collected as she explained the fabricated dental emergency. The premeditated nature of these actions, the false calls, the calculated deception to create an opportunity to be alone with Emma, cast a sinister shadow over what Sarah had initially framed as a tragic accident. These discoveries transformed what investigators might initially have considered a case of siblings fighting that escalated tragically into something far more disturbing, a deliberately planned scenario that resulted in Emma Mitchell's death. The Mitchell home yielded additional evidence as crime scene technicians conducted their thorough examination. In Sarah's bedroom, detectives found a journal that would become central to the prosecution's case. The entries, spanning several months before Emma's death, revealed Sarah's escalating resentment and increasingly dark fantasies about her sister. Emma got the lead in the school musical today, read one entry from 6 months before the murder. Mom and Dad acted like she'd won an Oscar. Nobody even asked how my day was. Nobody cares that I exist. Sometimes I think they wish I was the one who was never born. The entries grew progressively darker, with Sarah describing imagined scenarios where Emma was gone, and she finally received her parents' full attention and love. 2 weeks before Emma's death, an entry read, "I looked up how fragile the human neck is today. It's scary how easily a person could die from a fall or other accident. Makes you realize how temporary everything is." This digital and written trail of escalating resentment, combined with the physical evidence, began to paint a clear picture of motive and opportunity that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. Richard Mitchell arrived home at approximately 2:30 p.m. to find his house transformed into a crime scene, his younger daughter's body being removed by the medical examiner, and his wife sedated by paramedics after suffering a complete emotional collapse. Detective Liu described the father's reaction as the sound of a man's soul breaking, as Richard Mitchell fell to his knees in the driveway, a guttural cry of anguish escaping his throat that neighbors reported would haunt them for years. It was in the midst of this chaos that Sarah was formally taken into custody, not yet under arrest, but transported to the Portland Police Bureau's headquarters for further questioning. As she was escorted to the police vehicle, Sarah was overheard by multiple witnesses muttering, "She shouldn't have taken my shirt. This is her fault." This statement, suggesting blame rather than remorse, would later be introduced at trial as evidence of Sarah's inability to accept responsibility for her actions. At the Portland Police Bureau, with a juvenile advocate and attorney present, Sarah was interviewed in a specialized room designed for questioning minors. It was during this interview that Sarah's story began to shift in subtle but significant ways, a development that experienced investigators like Detective Liu recognized as a classic indicator of deception. In this second version of events, Sarah claimed that Emma had been taunting her about the confiscated T-shirt, following her around the house and making comments designed to provoke her. According to this new narrative, the sisters had argued at the top of the basement stairs. Emma had pushed Sarah first, and in defending herself, Sarah had pushed back, not intending for Emma to fall, just trying to create space between them. When questioned about why this critical detail of a physical confrontation had been absent from her initial account, Sarah's only explanation was, "I was in shock. I didn't remember everything clearly." The shifting narrative, combined with her flat affect and responses that seemed rehearsed, raised additional red flags for the investigative team. By evening on September 18th, the preliminary autopsy results provided the evidence needed to transform Sarah's status from witness to suspect. Dr. Brennan's detailed examination confirmed that Emma had died from a combination of cervical spine fracture and subsequent impact trauma from the fall down the stairs. But the critical finding was the evidence suggesting she had been pushed with significant force from behind. The injury pattern indicates the victim was struck or pushed from behind with considerable force, causing her to fall forward down the stairs, Dr. Brennan stated in his report. The angle and severity of the initial spinal injury are inconsistent with a loss of balance or stumble. This was a forceful push that sent the victim headfirst down a flight of stairs. With this medical confirmation, combined with the evidence of premeditation in Sarah's journal entries and phone records, Detective Liu formally arrested Sarah Mitchell at 8:20 p.m., charging her with second-degree murder in the death of her sister. The distinction between first and second-degree murder would become a point of intense legal debate in the coming months, with prosecutors ultimately having to decide whether the evidence supported an argument for premeditated first-degree murder or the lesser charge of second-degree murder committed in the heat of passion. The morning after Emma Mitchell's death, Portland awakened to headlines that reverberated through the close-knit community. 15-year-old arrested in sister's death. The city, known for its progressive values and strong sense of community, struggled to process the news that a teenager had allegedly killed her younger sibling in their family home. Local news coverage was extensive, with vans from every major Portland station parked on the Mitchell family street as neighbors gathered in shocked clusters. Their hushed conversations, punctuated by phrases like, "seemed like such a normal family," and "those poor parents." Detective Liu, now leading the homicide investigation, worked to shield the Mitchell family from the sudden media onslaught while simultaneously building a comprehensive case against Sarah. He was acutely aware that prosecuting a juvenile for murder would require extraordinary evidence and would face intense public scrutiny, particularly in a city like Portland, where juvenile justice reform was a frequent topic of public debate. At the Donald E. Long Juvenile Detention Home, Sarah Mitchell spent her first night in custody under suicide watch, though staff reported she showed surprisingly little emotion and slept through most of the night. Juvenile counselors noted in their intake assessment that Sarah exhibited flat affect inconsistent with the traumatic circumstances and a concerning lack of emotional response when discussing her sister's death. The initial psychological evaluation conducted the morning after her arrest revealed a teenager of above-average intelligence, with no prior history of violent behavior, though her school counselor had noted concerning patterns of resentment toward family members in sessions from the previous school year. What makes this case particularly complex, Dr. Melissa Torres, the forensic psychologist assigned to Sarah's evaluation, would later testify, is that Sarah presents as a relatively normal teenager in most respects. There were warning signs, the journal entries, the counselor's concerns, but nothing that clearly predicted this level of violence. The forensic evidence against Sarah continued to mount as laboratory analysis confirmed critical findings. Fiber evidence collected from Emma's clothing matched fibers from Sarah's bedroom carpet, suggesting Emma had been on that floor shortly before her death, contradicting Sarah's claim that Emma went straight to the basement. Additionally, analysis of the defensive bruises on Emma's arms revealed they had been inflicted within 30 minutes of her death and matched the approximate size and spacing of Sarah's hands. Most damning was the discovery through phone records and computer forensics that Sarah had searched online for how much force to push someone downstairs, and can pushing someone count as murder in the 3 days before Emma's death. These digital footprints demolished any remaining possibility that Emma's death was the result of an argument that tragically escalated in a moment of rage. This digital evidence tells a devastating story, prosecutor Rachel Donovan would later explain to the grand jury. Sarah Mitchell spent days contemplating this specific act. She researched the mechanics of it, the legal implications of it, and then she created an opportunity to be alone with Emma and carried it out. This was not an accident. This was not even a momentary loss of control. This was planned. Detective Liu's team made another crucial discovery when reviewing data from Sarah's phone. Text messages to her best friend Ashley revealed a pattern of increasingly disturbing comments about Emma. "I can't take another award ceremony where they parade Emma around like she's some kind of genius," read one message sent 2 weeks before the murder. "Sometimes I fantasize about what life would be like if I was an only child again." When interviewed, Ashley told investigators she hadn't taken these messages seriously, viewing them as Sarah venting normal sibling frustration. Sarah complained about Emma a lot, the visibly shaken teenager told Detective Liu. "But lots of siblings don't get along. I never thought she would actually hurt Emma. Sarah talked big, but I didn't think she meant any of it." As investigators continued their methodical work, additional inconsistencies emerged regarding the timeline Sarah had provided. The neighbor who had heard arguing and a crash at approximately 11:30 a.m. was adamant about the timing because she had been on a conference call that started at 11:15 and was still ongoing when she heard the disturbance. This placed Emma's death more than an hour earlier than Sarah had initially claimed. Time that Sarah had spent, according to phone records, searching online for what to do if someone dies in your house, and how long before rigor mortis sets in. The evidence clearly shows that Sarah waited for a significant period after Emma died before calling for help. Forensic specialist Dr. Helen Yamamoto testified at the preliminary hearing. She used that time to research, to think through her story, to position Emma's body in a way that might support an accidental fall narrative. These are not the actions of someone in shock or panic. These are the deliberate actions of someone trying to avoid consequences. The medical examiner's final report, released 10 days after Emma's death, provided the most complete picture of her final moments. Dr. Brennan determined that Emma had been pushed with significant force from behind at the top of the basement stairs, causing her to pitch forward and fracture her cervical spine on the edge of the 4th or 5th step. The fall had then continued, resulting in additional impact trauma as her small body tumbled down the remaining stairs. The primary injury that caused death was the cervical fracture, the report stated. However, the manner in which that injury occurred, the force and angle required to produce that specific fracture pattern, is inconsistent with a stumble or accidental loss of balance. The evidence indicates the victim was forcefully pushed from behind while standing at the top of the stairs. Dr. Brennan's report also addressed the defensive bruising on Emma's arms, determining they had occurred during a brief physical struggle that preceded the fatal push. The victim's defensive wounds indicate she was aware of the threat and attempted to protect herself or push away from her attacker, the report noted. These injuries occurred within minutes of the fatal push, suggesting a confrontation that escalated rapidly to lethal violence. Detective Liu's interviews with Sarah's teachers and school counselors added crucial context to understanding the psychological factors that had contributed to the crime. Sarah's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, shared that Sarah had been referred to her office multiple times over the previous year for what teachers described as concerning comments about her sister and her family. Sarah expressed feeling invisible in her own home. Mrs. Hendricks testified during the preliminary hearing. She felt her parents only noticed Emma's achievements and overlooked anything Sarah did. Whether this perception was accurate or distorted, it became Sarah's reality. A reality where she felt fundamentally unseen and unvalued compared to her younger sister. Sarah's English teacher provided an essay Sarah had written 6 months before Emma's death, a creative writing assignment where students were asked to write about a life-changing event. Sarah's essay disturbingly described a protagonist whose younger sibling dies in an accident, allowing the protagonist to finally receive their parents' undivided attention and love. At the time, I read it as fiction, as creative writing, the teacher explained, her voice thick with guilt. Looking back, I should have recognized it as a warning sign. Sarah was telegraphing her thoughts, her desires, and I missed it entirely. The scratches and bruises documented on both Sarah's and Emma's bodies became another critical element of the prosecution's case. Forensic analysis revealed that Emma had fought back during the confrontation at the top of the stairs, scratching Sarah's forearms as she tried to push her away. These marks, while minor, corroborated the medical examiner's findings that a physical struggle had preceded Emma's fall. These defensive injuries on both sisters tell us that Emma knew she was in danger, Dr. Brennan testified. She was trying to protect herself, trying to create distance from someone who was attacking her. The fact that this person was her own sister, someone she should have been able to trust implicitly, adds an additional layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. As the investigation continued, prosecutors faced difficult decisions about how to charge and try Sarah Mitchell. Oregon law permitted juveniles as young as 15 to be tried as adults for murder, but such decisions required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the severity of the crime, evidence of premeditation, and the defendant's psychological state and capacity for rehabilitation. After reviewing the substantial evidence of planning, the journal entries, the internet searches, the deliberate deception to create opportunity, District Attorney Margaret Foster announced at a press conference that Sarah Mitchell would be charged as an adult with first-degree murder, though the prosecution team was prepared to accept a second-degree murder conviction if the jury found the premeditation evidence insufficient. The calculated nature of this crime, the days of planning that preceded it, and the attempts to cover it up afterward leave us no choice but to pursue adult charges, Foster stated, her expression grave. Emma Mitchell deserved better than to die at the hands of someone she trusted. Justice demands that we hold her killer fully accountable, regardless of age. Public reaction to the decision was sharply divided. Child welfare advocates argued that 15 was too young to be tried as an adult, pointing to neuroscience research showing that adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in areas governing impulse control and consequence assessment. Others, particularly victims' rights groups, argued that the premeditated nature of the crime demanded adult accountability. Against this backdrop of community controversy, Sarah Mitchell was transferred from juvenile detention to the adult section of the Multnomah County Detention Center, where she would await a trial that would not only determine her fate but also force Portland to confront uncomfortable questions about juvenile justice, sibling rivalry, and whether a teenager who commits murder can ever truly be rehabilitated. The trial of State of Oregon versus Sarah Mitchell began on March 4, 2013, nearly 6 months after Emma Mitchell's death. The Multnomah County Courthouse, an imposing structure of granite and glass in downtown Portland, became the focal point for a case that had captured regional and national attention. The courthouse steps saw daily gatherings of both supporters and protesters, some carrying signs reading, "Justice for Emma," while others held banners proclaiming, "Children deserve second chances," and "Science says brains aren't fully formed." Inside, courtroom 502 had been prepared for the high-profile trial, with additional seating accommodating the extensive media presence and public interest. Judge Catherine Morrison entered at precisely 9 a.m., her silver hair and measured demeanor conveying the gravitas the case demanded. At 63, with 30 years of judicial experience, Morrison was known for her careful deliberation and intolerance for sensationalism. This trial will be conducted with the dignity and respect that both the victim and the defendant deserve, Judge Morrison announced her sharp gaze sweeping over the packed gallery. "I will not tolerate any outbursts, any attempts to influence the jury, or any behavior that compromises the integrity of these proceedings." Sarah Mitchell entered the courtroom flanked by her defense attorneys, Marcus Webb and Dr. Sophia Chen, a rare attorney-psychologist combination that signaled the defense's strategy to emphasize Sarah's psychological state and developmental limitations. Sarah's appearance had been carefully managed, her dyed black hair restored to its natural light brown, her clothing conservative and age-appropriate. The transformation aimed to present Sarah as a child, rather than the angry teenager captured in her social media photos. Across the aisle, prosecutor Rachel Donovan arranged her materials with practiced precision, her navy suit and confident bearing conveying prosecutorial authority. At 42, Donovan had built a reputation as one of Oregon's most effective prosecutors, with particular expertise in cases involving juvenile defendants. Her second chair, Assistant District Attorney James Park, reviewed witness lists, occasionally leaning in to share observations as jury selection began. Jury selection consumed 4 days, with both sides probing potential jurors' attitudes toward trying juveniles as adults and their ability to weigh evidence of premeditation against arguments about adolescent brain development. Defense attorney Webb focused his questions on empathy and understanding of teenage psychology, asking potential jurors whether they could consider that a 15-year-old might not fully comprehend the permanence of death or the long-term consequences of their actions. Prosecutor Donovan, conversely, emphasized questions about personal responsibility and the capacity for planning, asking potential jurors, if the evidence showed that someone spent days researching and planning a specific act, does their age change your assessment of whether that planning constitutes premeditation? The contrasting approaches highlighted the central tension that would define the entire trial. The final jury comprised 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 24 to 71, with occupations including a software developer, a retired school principal, a nurse, a small business owner, and a construction manager. 6 of the jurors were parents, a demographic reality that both prosecution and defense had analyzed carefully in their selection strategy. Rachel Donovan's opening statement began with a simple but devastating timeline of the day Emma Mitchell died, delivered in the clear, authoritative voice that had become her trademark. On September 18, 2012, 12-year-old Emma Mitchell went to school, excited about a science project, looking forward to her violin lesson. That afternoon, unaware that she would never leave her family home alive. Donovan paused, making eye contact with each juror. Emma came home early that day because her 15-year-old sister, Sarah Mitchell, had lied to school officials, impersonating their mother to have Emma released into her care. Sarah had been planning this moment for days, researching online how to push someone downstairs, how much force it would take, whether it would count as murder. Donovan methodically outlined the state's case, emphasizing the physical evidence, the bruising pattern on Emma's body inconsistent with an accidental fall, the defensive wounds showing Emma had tried to protect herself, the forensic evidence proving a forceful push from behind. The victim's injuries tell a story, Donovan told the jury, her voice growing softer but more intense. They tell us that Emma Mitchell was shoved with significant force from behind while standing at the top of basement stairs. They tell us she tried to defend herself during a confrontation with her sister. They tell us her death was no accident, but the culmination of days of planning by someone who resented her sister's accomplishments enough to wish her dead. Donovan's opening continued with detailed discussion of the premeditation evidence. Sarah's journal entries expressing wishes that Emma would disappear, her internet searches about pushing people and legal consequences, her carefully orchestrated plan to create an opportunity to be alone with her sister. This was not a momentary loss of control, she argued, pacing slowly before the jury box. This was the execution of a plan that Sarah Mitchell had been contemplating, researching, and refining for days. The motive, sibling resentment over a borrowed t-shirt and years of feeling overshadowed, may seem trivial to us, but the evidence will show it was powerful enough to drive Sarah to end her sister's life. Defense attorney Marcus Webb rose for his opening statement with a deliberately different energy, his posture and voice projecting compassion rather than prosecution certainty. What happened to Emma Mitchell was a tragedy that has devastated a family and shocked a community, he began, his voice gentle but clear. No one disputes that Emma died as a result of a confrontation with her sister. But there is a profound difference between an accident that occurs during a fight between siblings and a calculated, premeditated murder. That difference will be critical as you evaluate the evidence in this case. Webb moved closer to the jury, establishing the eye contact that would characterize his entire presentation. Sarah Mitchell was 15 years old when this tragedy occurred. 15. Her brain was still developing, particularly in the areas that govern impulse control, consequence assessment, and emotional regulation. This isn't an excuse. It's biology, confirmed by decades of neuroscience research that we will present to you. Webb continued by addressing the prosecution's evidence directly, offering alternative interpretations that would form the foundation of the defense strategy. Yes, Sarah wrote troubling things in her journal, but teenagers write dramatic, emotional things all the time, expressing feelings they would never act upon. Yes, Sarah searched concerning topics online, but adolescents research dark subjects constantly, exploring ideas through the safety of a screen without any intention of acting on them. And yes, the sisters fought that day, but what began as a typical sibling argument escalated tragically when Emma lost her balance and fell. The defense opening concluded with a direct appeal to the jury's understanding of childhood and adolescence. The prosecution wants you to see Sarah as a cold-blooded killer who happens to be 15, Webb said, his voice carrying clear emotion. We ask you to see her as she truly is, a troubled teenager who made terrible decisions in a moment of rage, whose still developing brain could not process the permanence of what was happening. The appropriate response to this tragedy is not to destroy another young life by locking Sarah away as an adult. The appropriate response is to hold her accountable while recognizing the fundamental difference between an adolescent's capacity for judgment and an adult's. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess before witness testimony would begin, and as the jury filed out, Richard and Jennifer Mitchell sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, their faces gaunt with grief. They had made the agonizing decision to support the prosecution, believing that justice for Emma required full accountability for Sarah's actions, even as their hearts broke over losing both daughters. One to death, one to prison. The first week of testimony focused on the physical evidence and the sequence of events leading to Emma's death. Detective Marcus Liu walked the jury through his initial investigation, describing the inconsistencies he had noted immediately upon arriving at the scene. Using photographs displayed on large courtroom screens, Liu pointed out the position of Emma's body, the lack of any scattered items that might suggest she had been carrying something when she fell, and the pattern of blood evidence that contradicted an accidental fall scenario. Everything about the scene felt staged, Liu testified, his manner professional but the gravity evident in his voice. The position of the body, the story Sarah told, the timeline she provided, none of it aligned with the physical evidence we were documenting. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Dr. Chen attempted to introduce ambiguity into Liu's conclusions, suggesting alternative explanations for the inconsistencies. Detective Liu, Isn't it possible that Sarah, as a traumatized 15-year-old who had just witnessed her sister's death, simply got confused about the timeline and certain details? Chen asked, her tone suggesting this was the most reasonable interpretation. Liu's response was measured but firm. In my 20 years of experience, I've interviewed hundreds of witnesses to traumatic events. Confusion typically manifests as uncertainty. Witnesses say, "I think," or "I'm not sure." Sarah's statements were definitive and detailed, just inconsistent with the physical evidence. That pattern is more consistent with fabrication than confusion. The medical examiner's testimony proved devastating for the defense. Dr. Thomas Brennan, speaking with the clinical precision of someone who had performed thousands of autopsies, explained to the jury exactly how Emma had died and why her injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall. The primary cause of death was a cervical spine fracture at the C3-C4 vertebrae. Dr. Brennan explained when using anatomical diagrams to illustrate for the jury. This particular fracture, combined with the angle of impact and the severity of the injury, indicates Emma was moving with significant velocity when her neck struck the edge of the stair. That velocity is inconsistent with a stumble or loss of balance. It is, however, consistent with being forcefully pushed from behind. When Prosecutor Donovan asked Dr. Brennan about the defensive injuries on Emma's arms and hands, his testimony painted a heartbreaking picture of Emma's final moments. These bruises and abrasions indicate Emma was in a physical confrontation shortly before her death. The positioning of these injuries suggests she was trying to push someone away from her, trying to protect herself. These are classic defensive wounds that we see when someone knows they're in danger. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Brennan continued. Based on the totality of the injuries, I can reconstruct the sequence of events with reasonable medical certainty. Emma and her attacker were in close physical contact at the top of the stairs. Emma sustained defensive injuries as she tried to push away. The attacker then pushed Emma with significant force, causing her to pitch forward and sustain the fatal cervical fracture as she fell. Cross-examination by Marcus Webb attempted to challenge Dr. Brennan's certainty about the force required and whether it might have been unintentional. Perhaps Sarah pushed Emma to create space during an argument without intending for her to fall. Dr. Brennan acknowledged that intent was not something he could determine from physical evidence alone, but he stood firm on his conclusion that the push had been forceful and deliberate, rather than a light shove or accidental contact. Forensic computer specialist Agent David Kim of the FBI's Portland field office provided testimony about Sarah's digital footprint in the days before Emma's death. The jury watched as Kim displayed Sarah's search history on the courtroom screens, the dates and times making clear this was no idle curiosity, but sustained research over multiple days. September 12th, 6 days before Emma's death, Sarah searched, "Can you die from falling downstairs?" and "How much force to push someone?" Kim testified, reading from his report. September 14th, 4 days before, she searched "broken neck from fall" and "do police investigate accidents at home?" And on the morning of September 18th, after both girls were home but before emergency services were called, Sarah searched "what to do when someone dies" and "how long until body gets stiff." This digital evidence, combined with the physical findings, created a comprehensive picture of premeditation that the defense struggled to counter. When Dr. Chen cross-examined Kim, she attempted to contextualize the searches as typical adolescent, curiosity or anxiety rather than actual planning. But the specificity and timing of the searches made this argument difficult to sustain. The prosecution's presentation of Sarah's journal entries was particularly damaging, with several jurors visibly affected as Donovan read selected passages aloud. March 15th, 2012. Emma won another award today. Mom cried. She was so proud. I could disappear and nobody would even notice. Sometimes I wish I was an only child again. Donovan read, her voice steady but the words themselves devastating. July 22nd. I looked up how fragile people are today. It's scary how easily someone could die and how it could look like an accident. Makes you realize nothing is permanent. The entry from 2 days before Emma's death was perhaps most chilling. I can't live like this anymore. Invisible in my own house. Something has to change. I've been thinking about how to make it change. Richard and Jennifer Mitchell's testimony was emotionally devastating for everyone in the courtroom. Richard, his voice breaking repeatedly, described the morning of Emma's death, the argument over the T-shirt, Sarah's disproportionate rage, his decision to take Emma to school while leaving Sarah to take the bus. I keep replaying that morning, he said, tears streaming down his face. If I had just let them both wear whatever they wanted, if I had driven Sarah too, if I had paid more attention to how angry she was, maybe Emma would still be alive. Jennifer Mitchell required multiple breaks during her testimony, her grief so profound that Judge Morrison called an early recess to allow her time to compose herself. Through tears, Jennifer described Sarah's escalating resentment over the past year, Emma's obliviousness to her sister's jealousy, and the family dynamics that had apparently created such toxic competition between the sisters. I thought it was normal sibling rivalry, Jennifer sobbed. Every family has some of that, right? The older child feeling overshadowed when the younger one excels. I talked to Sarah about it. I tried to make sure she knew we were proud of her too, but I didn't realize how deep her resentment went, how much she truly hated her sister. I failed both my daughters. I failed to protect Emma, and I failed to get Sarah the help she clearly needed. The prosecution rested its case after 2 weeks of testimony, having built a comprehensive narrative of premeditated murder driven by sibling resentment. The physical evidence, digital footprint, and Sarah's own words combined to create what Prosecutor Donovan characterized as an overwhelming case that Sarah Mitchell planned and executed her sister's murder. The defense case focused heavily on expert testimony regarding adolescent brain development and Sarah's psychological state. Dr. Robert Feldman, a renowned neuroscientist from Stanford University, testified at length about the structural differences between adolescent and adult brains, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the region governing impulse control, consequence assessment, and rational decision-making. The adolescent brain is fundamentally different from the adult brain, Dr. Feldman explained, using neuroimaging scans to illustrate his points for the jury. The prefrontal cortex, which acts as the brain's CEO, making rational decisions, controlling impulses, understanding long-term consequences, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. At 15, Sarah's brain was literally incapable of the kind of sustained rational planning and consequence assessment that we expect from adults. Dr. Feldman addressed the prosecution's premeditation evidence directly, offering an alternative neurological interpretation. What appears as planning to adult observers may actually be adolescent rumination, circular thinking driven by emotion rather than rational planning. When teenagers are upset, they can become fixated on their grievances, researching and fantasizing about solutions without truly processing the real-world implications. It's a failure of the prefrontal cortex to regulate the emotional centers of the brain. Prosecutor Donovan's cross-examination of Dr. Feldman was sharp and effective, forcing him to acknowledge that brain development differences did not mean teenagers were incapable of understanding right from wrong or incapable of planning actions. Dr. Feldman, do 15-year-olds understand that pushing someone down stairs could kill them? Donovan asked pointedly. Generally, yes, Feldman conceded. Do 15-year-olds understand that killing someone is wrong? Yes. Do 15-year-olds have the capacity to make plans that extend over multiple days? For example, planning a school project or a social event? Yes, but so the issue isn't that Sarah Mitchell's brain made her incapable of planning or understanding consequences, Donovan interrupted. The issue is that her brain made it easier for her to prioritize her immediate emotional needs, her resentment, her anger, over her sister's right to live. Is that accurate? Dr. Feldman paused before responding. That's a simplified interpretation, but yes, adolescent brains are more likely to prioritize emotional considerations over a rational assessment of long-term consequences. The defense called Dr. Allison Reeves, Sarah's therapist, who had been treating her for depression and family conflict in the months before Emma's death. Dr. Reeves testified about Sarah's feelings of invisibility within her family and the genuine psychological distress she had been experiencing. Sarah felt fundamentally unseen by her parents, Dr. Reeves explained. Every session, she would describe feeling like a ghost in her own home, present physically, but invisible emotionally. Her parents' attention and affection seemed, from Sarah's perspective, to flow entirely to Emma and her accomplishments. Whether this perception was entirely accurate or somewhat distorted, it became Sarah's psychological reality. Dr. Reeves's testimony established that Sarah had been suffering genuine emotional distress. But under cross-examination, Prosecutor Donovan elicited a crucial admission. Dr. Reeves, in all your sessions with Sarah, did she ever express concern about harming her sister or others? No, Dr. Reeves admitted. Did she ever mention the violent thoughts she was writing in her journal or the research she was conducting online? No. So Sarah was capable of recognizing that these thoughts were problematic enough to hide from her therapist, correct? That interpretation is possible, yes. The defense's final major witness was Sarah Mitchell herself, a risky decision that defense attorneys Webb and Chen had debated extensively before deciding that the jury needed to hear directly from Sarah to understand her as a child, rather than a monster. Sarah took the stand dressed conservatively, her demeanor nervous but composed as Webb led her through preliminary questions establishing her background, her relationship with Emma, and her emotional state in the months before the tragedy. Sarah, did you love your sister? Webb asked gently. Yes, Sarah responded, her voice small. I did love her. I also resented her sometimes, which made me feel terrible, but I loved her. Tell the jury what happened on September 18th in your own words. Sarah took a deep breath before responding, her prepared testimony clearly rehearsed, but delivered with apparent emotion. Emma came home and she was in a good mood, talking about school. I was still angry about the shirt thing from that morning, and I guess I said something mean about how Mom and Dad always took her side. Emma told me I was being ridiculous, that they loved us both the same. We started arguing, and it got more heated. We were at the top of the basement stairs because I had been going down to do laundry. Sarah paused, tears beginning to flow. Emma pushed me first. She was angry and she pushed my shoulder. I pushed her back, not hard, just to get her to stop. But she was standing wrong, or her balance was off, or something, and she just fell backwards down the stairs. It happened so fast. 1 second we were arguing, and the next she was falling, and there was this terrible noise, and then silence. Sarah, did you intend to push Emma down the stairs? Webb asked, his tone compassionate. No, Sarah said firmly, looking directly at the jury. I swear I didn't. I just wanted her to stop pushing me. I never meant for her to fall. I never wanted her to die. Webb then addressed the damaging evidence directly. Sarah, the prosecution has shown the jury journal entries where you wrote about wishing Emma wasn't around, and internet searches about falling downstairs. Can you explain those? Sarah's response had clearly been crafted carefully by her legal team. The journal was where I wrote my feelings, even the ugly ones. when I was really mad at Emma or felt ignored by my parents. I would write about wishing things were different. It was like a fantasy, a way to vent without actually doing anything. The internet searches. I was curious about how fragile people are after I had that thought in my journal. It wasn't like I was actually planning anything. I was just researching ideas I'd been thinking about. Prosecutor Donovan's cross-examination of Sarah was methodical and devastating, systematically dismantling her testimony and forcing her to confront the inconsistencies in her various accounts of what happened. Sarah, you've told several different versions of what happened that day. To Detective Liu, initially, you said you heard Emma scream and found her at the bottom of the stairs. Is that correct? I was confused, Sarah responded. I was in shock. But you were specific about the details, what time it happened, what you were doing. Those weren't confused statements. They were detailed lies, weren't they? I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly. Donovan pressed harder, her tone remaining professional, but the questions becoming increasingly pointed. Sarah, in your journal 2 days before Emma died, you wrote, "Something has to change." What did you mean by that? I meant that I needed to change how I was feeling, or talk to my therapist more, or something. Did you write about talking to your therapist? Or did you write about researching how people die from falls? Sarah had no good answer, her silence speaking volumes. Donovan continued, walking through each piece of evidence. The phone calls impersonating their mother, the timing of the searches on the morning of Emma's death, the defensive injuries on Emma's arms showing she had been trying to protect herself. Sarah, you testified that you pushed Emma lightly, just to get her to stop. But the medical examiner determined that Emma was pushed with significant force, enough force to fracture her spine before she even reached the bottom of the stairs. Can you explain that? I don't know, Sarah said, her composure beginning to crack. Maybe I pushed harder than I remember. Everything happened so fast. Or maybe you pushed Emma with exactly the amount of force you intended, Donovan suggested, after days of planning, after researching, after creating an opportunity to be alone with her. Maybe this wasn't an accident at all. No, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. It was an accident. I didn't mean for her to die. I just wanted her to leave me alone for once. Just once. I wanted to matter more than her. This final admission, that Sarah had wanted to matter more than Emma, undercut the defense's entire narrative and provided the prosecution with the motive statement they needed. The cross-examination concluded with Sarah's credibility in tatters, her multiple changing stories, and inability to reconcile the evidence with her claims of innocence, leaving several jurors visibly skeptical. The closing arguments began on March 25, 2013, 3 weeks after the trial had commenced. Rachel Donovan's closing was powerful and focused, methodically reviewing the evidence and emphasizing the fundamental principle that planning and intent, not age, determined the nature of the crime. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about choices, Donovan began. Sarah Mitchell made a series of choices over multiple days that culminated in her sister's death. She chose to research how to hurt someone and make it look accidental. She chose to lie to school officials to create an opportunity to be alone with Emma. She chose to engage Emma in a confrontation at the top of the basement stairs. And she chose to push her 12-year-old sister with enough force to break her neck and send her tumbling to her death. Donovan addressed the defense's brain development arguments directly. Yes, Sarah's brain was still developing, but having an immature brain is not a license to kill. Sarah's brain was developed enough to plan, to deceive, to research, and to execute those plans. Her brain was developed enough to try covering up what she had done. The only thing Sarah's brain couldn't do was feel appropriate remorse for what she had done. And that doesn't excuse her actions. It makes them more disturbing. Donovan concluded with a reminder about the victim. Emma Mitchell was 12 years old. She loved marine biology and playing violin. She was kind to classmates who struggled. She had dreams of discovering new species in the deep ocean. All of that potential, all of that promise, was taken by someone who loved a t-shirt more than her sister's life. Justice for Emma demands that you hold Sarah Mitchell accountable for making the choice, the planned, researched, deliberate choice to end her sister's life. Marcus Webb's closing argument for the defense was passionate and focused on empathy, asking the jury to see Sarah as a troubled child rather than a calculating killer. "This case is a tragedy for everyone involved," Webb began. "Emma Mitchell died. Richard and Jennifer Mitchell lost both their daughters. And Sarah Mitchell, at 15 years old, made a terrible, impulsive decision in a moment of anger that she will regret for the rest of her life." Webb reminded the jury of the scientific evidence about adolescent brain development, arguing that Sarah's actions, while terrible, were the product of an immature brain incapable of fully processing consequences. The prosecution wants you to believe that Sarah spent days carefully planning a murder. But the evidence shows something different. A troubled teenager who was drowning in resentment, who fantasized and ruminated and researched in the way teenagers do without truly comprehending that these thoughts could become reality. Webb concluded with a plea for mercy and appropriate charges. "We're not asking you to excuse what Sarah did. We're asking you to recognize what Sarah is, a child who made a terrible mistake. The appropriate verdict is not first-degree murder, which requires adult capacity for premeditation. The appropriate verdict is manslaughter, holding Sarah accountable while recognizing the fundamental difference between a 15-year-old's capacity for judgment and an adult's." Judge Morrison's instructions to the jury outlined the elements required for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, emphasizing that the burden of proof remained with the prosecution to demonstrate premeditation and intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury began deliberations at 2 p.m. on March 25, 2013. After 7 hours of deliberation, spanning 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict. Sarah Mitchell sat between her attorneys, her face pale and her hands trembling, as the jury foreman, a retired school principal, stood to deliver the verdict. In the matter of State of Oregon versus Sarah Mitchell, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word guilty seemed to echo endlessly through the courtroom. Sarah's grandmother let out a strangled sob from the gallery, while Richard and Jennifer Mitchell sat motionless, their faces showing not triumph but the hollow emptiness of parents who had lost everything. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. The intervening period saw intense public debate about the verdict, with legal experts and child welfare advocates appearing across media platforms to discuss whether justice had been served or whether the jury had failed to adequately consider Sarah's youth and developmental limitations. On April 15, 2013, Sarah Mitchell returned to courtroom 502 for sentencing. The hearing began with victim impact statements, starting with Richard Mitchell, whose grief had aged him visibly in the 7 months since Emma's death. "Emma was the light of our lives," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She made everything better just by being in the room. Her curiosity, her kindness, her laughter, all of that is gone now, taken by someone who should have protected her. I look at Sarah and I see my daughter, but I also see the person who murdered my other daughter. I don't know how to reconcile those two realities. I don't know if I ever will." Jennifer Mitchell's statement was read by a victim advocate, as she found herself unable to speak directly. Emma's room remains untouched. Her violin sits in its stand by the window. Her marine biology books are still stacked on her desk. I go in there sometimes and I can almost hear her practicing, almost hear her calling me to look at something interesting she's discovered. Then reality crashes back and I remember that Sarah made sure Emma will never practice again, never discover anything again, never grow up to be the scientist she dreamed of becoming. When Sarah was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, she stood shakily, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm sorry," she began, tears flowing freely. "I know that doesn't fix anything or bring Emma back. I know it's not enough. I didn't mean for Emma to die. I was angry and hurt, and I wasn't thinking about anything except my own feelings. I pushed her, and in that second everything changed forever. I took away her whole future. I destroyed my parents' lives. I destroyed my own life. If I could take it back, I would, but I can't, and I have to live with that forever." Judge Morrison's sentencing statement was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging both Sarah's youth and the severity of her crime. This court has carefully considered all the evidence presented at trial, including extensive expert testimony regarding adolescent brain development. The science is clear that 15-year-olds process decisions differently than adults. However, the evidence in this case demonstrates a level of planning and deliberation that cannot be explained away by developmental limitations alone. The judge continued, addressing Sarah directly. "Sarah Mitchell, you have been convicted of first-degree murder in the death of your sister, Emma Mitchell. The evidence showed that you spent days contemplating this act, researching how to carry it out, and then deliberately creating an opportunity to be alone with Emma. Your motive, resentment over feeling overshadowed by your sister's accomplishments, reflects a profound self-centeredness and inability to value another person's life above your own emotional comfort." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison prepared to announce the sentence. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with a possibility of parole after serving the minimum 25 years. This sentence reflects both the severity of your crime and your age at the time of the offense. You will be eligible for parole when you are 40 years old enough, one hopes, that your brain will have fully matured, and you will have had time to truly comprehend the magnitude of what you took from Emma, from your parents, and from yourself." The sentence, while severe, was shorter than what first-degree murder typically carried for adults, reflecting some consideration of Sarah's age. Still, it meant Sarah would spend her entire young adulthood in prison, emerging, if she ever gained parole, as a middle-aged woman who had spent more than half her life incarcerated. As Sarah was led from the courtroom, she turned back toward her parents one final time. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. I love you. I'm so sorry." Richard and Jennifer Mitchell sat frozen, unable or unwilling to respond, their faces reflecting the impossible complexity of loving someone who had destroyed everything they held dear. In the years following Sarah Mitchell's sentencing, her case became a touchstone in debates about juvenile justice, brain development, and appropriate punishment for young offenders. The Mitchell case was cited in law school courses, referenced in advocacy materials for both victims' rights and juvenile justice reform, and discussed in countless think pieces about the intersection of neuroscience and legal culpability. Sarah herself became, in some ways, a symbol rather than a person, an abstraction in debates about juvenile justice rather than a real teenager serving a real sentence. Yet behind the legal discussions and advocacy arguments, Sarah Mitchell continued to exist, to age, to change within the Oregon correctional system that would be her home for at least the next 2.5 decades. The tragedy of Emma Mitchell's death and Sarah Mitchell's imprisonment stands as a stark reminder of how family dynamics, adolescent psychology, and momentary decisions can intersect to create irreversible consequences. Two sisters who once played together, read together, grew up together, became victim and perpetrator. Their shared childhood home transformed from a place of safety to a crime scene. Their shared future reduced to one life ended and another life consumed by punishment and regret. In Portland, Oregon, where rain falls soft and frequent, washing the streets clean but never quite washing away the memories, the Mitchell case remains an open wound, a family destroyed, a community shaken, and questions about justice, development, and punishment that have no easy answers, only the ongoing aftermath of choices made and lives forever altered.